Father, we pray that as we go into your word today, your Spirit will be present with us, guiding us into understanding, so that we don't look at the text and read ourselves into it, and that we don't seek application from our own human wisdom, but that we will understand it as you originally intended it to be understood, and that we will apply it when fitting to our own lives. We thank you for the privilege that you've given us to live the lives that you have given us, and also the privilege that you've given us and the ability to freely gather as a group of believers to study your word whenever there's so many people who would long and who do long to have such freedom, God. Let us not take this for granted, but every time we gather, let us recognize the privilege we've been given and use it unto your glory. By the end of this Bible study, may we love you more than we ever have before, and may we desire to be closer to you more than we ever have before as well, God. You know what's going on in the hearts and minds of every individual here, God. I pray that you will calm our minds and soothe our hearts, open up our ears to what you have to say, open up our ears to what one another has to say, and help us speak when it's time to speak, and help us be silent when it's time to be silent. And above all, God, let us focus on you. Let us set aside all outside distractions, all worldly things that might incline us to look somewhere other than you. And during this time that we have set before us, let us truly focus on you and what you reveal in your word. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for everything that you have done, you are doing, and you will do. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so today we are starting 2 Samuel. I fully intended on starting this a little bit sooner, because originally the plan was to get started with 2 Samuel at the beginning of the year, because we went through 1 Samuel, and then we went into Colossians as a little break in between, and then we're going to 2 Samuel. But originally I was going to we were going to go through Colossians one chapter each week, and it was going to be a 4-week thing. But we ended up doubling that, and it ended up being an 8-week thing where we went through about a half chapter each week. But we got to go more in depth, which I think is good. Because as we go back into 2 Samuel, we are going to be returning to, Lord willing, a chapter each week. There might be some weeks where we have to break it down, and we're just going to kind of use judgment there. There's certain chapters that are really significant. Like whenever we get to 2 Samuel chapter 7, we might end up having to split that into 2 weeks, because that is such an instrumental and important chapter in the grand scheme of all the Bible. And so there might be some weeks where we split it up, but by and large, I am hoping to try to cover a chapter each week. Not because you couldn't go more in depth, but because since we're only gathering one time a week for this particular Bible study, if we went any slower than that, it would be a lot harder to keep track and remember the story going that far. You know what I mean? Like if we could potentially spend 2 hours studying 6 verses at a time, but it would take us so long to get through the book, and also by the time we got to the end of each chapter, we would probably forget what the beginning of the chapter said. And so for the sake of this Bible study, we are going to be covering the main points. We are going to be covering just the broad overview of the story, and we'll be taking little segues into moments of depth. But the rest of it, hopefully, will just motivate you to go study it even more deeply. I did mention this whenever we went through 1 Samuel, but I believe that 1 and 2 Samuel are probably the height of biblical literature whenever it comes to and not even just biblical literature, just the height of literature in general. Even if I did not believe that the Bible was the inspired word of God, I think I would hold that 1 and 2 Samuel are some of just the greatest narrative storytelling to have ever existed, because it's just amazing. There's so much drama and political intrigue and so many things going on behind the scenes of all this that it's just a fascinating story. I don't know why we haven't seen more movie adaptations of it, even from a secular audience, because it really is just fantastic. But we're specifically obviously going to be looking at it from a biblical perspective, and we're going to continue studying it from the perspective of what we've covered thus far, which means that we need to cover a little bit of context, because it has been over 8 weeks. It's probably been about 10 or 11 weeks since we were actually in Samuel. So could I get some of y'all to kind of give us a brief recap on the context leading into 1 Samuel, maybe? So not the context of 1 Samuel itself, but just give me the social, political, governmental setting that we see at the beginning of Samuel.
There's no king.
There's no king in Israel, right? That is probably the quickest, brief way to summarize it, right? The people of Israel, they've already been freed from Egypt. They have already spent their time in the wilderness. They have already gone into the promised land, and they have been there for a few hundred years. During that time period, there were a lot of judges that God would send, and whenever you think judge, I don't want you to think as much guy holding a gavel as I want you to think a man holding a sword. We're kind of thinking more along the lines of Greek mythological type figures, except they were actual historical people who did do the judging thing, but primarily their role was to deliver the people from pagan oppressors. And so we had that cycle, but as the book of Judges progressed, the world was getting worse and worse and worse, to where by the end of the book, it stated a few times that there was no king in Israel and everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. Right? So the people had just totally abandoned the law given them by Moses, and they just totally strayed. That's not good. And then we go into 1 Samuel, and what do we see happen? Maybe somebody get me up to the point of Saul, right? And I don't need like a super in-depth recap because we do want to get to the book of 2 Samuel. But just get me to the arrival of Saul. What was going on at the end of that period of the Judges? Hey, Eric.
Hey.
What do we see going on there?
You said during Judges?
Well, no. So in the book of 1 Samuel, but leading up to Saul's arrival, right? Because Saul doesn't show up for a few chapters. What happens at the very beginning of 1 Samuel?
Hannah has
A son.
son,
Yeah, so there's this woman named Hannah, and she's praying for a son, and God gives it to her. And what is that son's name? Samuel. And who does Samuel grow up to be?
A prophet.
Yeah, he's the final judge, and he's also a prophet, right? And what is it like with him in charge? What happens throughout the land?
The land flourishes.
The land flourishes. There's peace. It's amazing. And so everything stayed that way, correct? No. What happened?
The people started demanding for a king, and they didn't want Samuel to be their leader anymore. And so Samuel warns them and says that, okay, if you want someone to rule over you, you can have someone, but they're going to take everything away from you.
Yeah, so Samuel, as a prophet, he gives this pronouncement, right? The people say, we want a king, which is really sad because they were already doing so well under Samuel. But they look and they're like, hey, dude, you're getting old. Your kids are deadbeats. We need a king. Because all the other nations have kings, and we want to be like the other nations. The issue is that they were not supposed to be like the other nations. They were supposed to be like God, and God was supposed to be their king. Samuel's offended by this, and God says, hey, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. And he says, give them a king. And that's whenever, like Brianne pointed out, Samuel gets up there and he says, hey, I'll give you a king, but let me tell you what he's going to do. He's going to take. And this is going to be true for every king that reigns over Israel, including David, as we're going to see. David may be a godly king, but he is also going to take from people. And that's going to be something that we're going to be dealing with a lot, and he's going to be dealing with a lot in 2 Samuel, because he's going to have to pay for that. Because with great power comes great responsibility. And if David is a man after God's own heart, he's going to really have to pay for some of the stuff he does. And we're going to see that a lot in this book. But a king is appointed, and what is this king's name? Saul. And how do you describe Saul? Tall, dark, and handsome. Right? He is a manly, earthly, worldly king. He's the definition of what everybody wanted. He's tall, he's good looking, and he knows how to fight. And he knows how to get an army together. He'll threaten people to get an army together. And he's successful in that way, but he doesn't seem to have a spiritual bone in his body. And whenever he is spiritual, it seems like it's mainly just lip service to God in order to further serve himself. And so really what God does is he allows the people to get a taste of what they asked for. Because God, he's a gentleman. He's not going to force himself upon you. And so if you want a worldly king, he'll give you a worldly king. But because God is gracious, he won't leave you with that. He did make a promise to the people of Israel, and he has a plan. And he's going to eventually bring about this ultimate king, the Messiah, through this line. Right? And so he does have something he's going to do here, but he gave them a taste of their own medicine. But eventually, because of Saul's folly, he is rebuked on several occasions, and the kingdom is renounced from him. Right? His dynasty will not endure. He does have an amazing son named Jonathan, but Jonathan will never sit on the throne. Instead, God says that he's going to appoint a different type of king. And how does they describe this king?
Man after his own heart, God's own
A
heart.
man after his own heart. Right? So he says, because you asked for a king, I'll leave you with a king, but I'm not going to allow you to remain like the nations because I've called you to be different. So he says, I'm going to give you a king who reflects me because that was the goal, right? He was supposed to be their king. So the second best thing is a king who points them back to him. And so he picks a person. Who does he pick? David. And David is immediately put on the throne, right? No. Even where we find him currently in 2 Samuel, he's not going to be on the throne. That's not going to happen until next chapter. So next week, we'll get to finally see it after all this time. It took even longer from David's perspective. But he isn't immediately on the throne. Where do we find David at?
In the courts of Saul.
But where does he start even before that?
The shepherd's field.
Shepherd's fields, right? He's in a shepherd's field. He's anointed as a king, and Samuel kind of welcomes him into a treasonous conspiracy where from being a tiny little teenager, David knows he's going to be king whenever Saul is still on the throne. And so there's all this political intrigue there. David knows something, and we know something that nobody else knows, right? And it's like a little secret. And the rumors begin to spread, but nobody knows fully what's going on. Eventually, David is invited to play music in Saul's courts, and through a list of different events, including the slaying of a big giant, David becomes a warrior in Saul's army, and it's super awesome, and it's super great. But what happens?
They start cheering on David, and Saul gets jealous.
Yeah, Saul gets jealous. They come home from war, and the women are screaming, or they're singing. Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his tens of thousands. And we know Saul at this point, right? Saul is a power-hungry guy, and he doesn't like this. And it's not just Saul, right? That's the issue. It's all of us. We're all like Saul, right? Because Saul, he's the definition of a worldly king. So we're not supposed to look at Saul and say, ooh, look how bad he is. We're supposed to look at Saul and say, oh, look how much he's like us. And then we look at ourselves, we're like, oh, look how bad I am. Because that's who we are. And then you're supposed to look at David and be like, whoa, now this dude is special. And so whenever Saul turns against David, David kills him, right?
No.
Why not?
He won't.
He's the Lord's anointed.
But David's the Lord's anointed. So why won't he touch Saul?
Because that's not how he's going to get on the throne.
Yeah, David refuses. He says, if I'm going to be on the throne, he doesn't say this, but it's implied. He says, if I'm going to be on the throne, God's going to be the one who has to put me there. Right? He's not going to do anything that looks like a political maneuvering to get on the throne. Right? There's going to be some things that people might suggest are like he is doing, but if so, he's not very good at it. Right? Because yes, he is best friends with the king's son, and yes, he does marry the king's daughter, but he's not using those for political advantages. He loves them both. And so that's why he pursues them. So when Saul turns against him, David goes on the run. And he flees into the wilderness and he's by himself. And he spends probably a good 10 to 12 years on the run from Saul. And they go back and forth, and there's multiple times whenever Saul's on the verge of catching David, and then God will distract him and lead him away. And it's a really kind of fun series of chapters. And there's sometimes where David has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he chooses not to. And it's because he's the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to do that. He is not going to lift his hand against Saul. And we get the impression that David really loves Saul. And we're going to see that in the chapter we cover today. But then that leads us to the very end of the book, where we actually see something that we're going to talk about today. Because today we're talking about David learning of Saul and Jonathan's fate. Which means that the most important thing we could cover context-wise is what happened to Saul and Jonathan. So what happened at the very end of 1 Samuel?
They died.
They died. Yeah, how did they die? Do you remember?
They were in war.
Mm-hmm.
The Philistines.
Yeah, so first off, where's David been staying lately?
With the Philistines.
He's been with the Philistines, but he's kind of secretly been fighting on behalf...
Double agent.
Well, yeah, he's been a double agent. It's actually been a really cool story. Once again, so much political intrigue. He's been a double agent. He's been living with the Philistines, but he's been fighting on behalf of the people of Judah, right? So the southern region of Israel, right? Because Judah is the tribe he's from, and it's also the biggest tribe down there. So he's been a double agent, and he was going to go fight with the Philistines against Saul and his armies, but the people of the Philistines were like, we're not letting David fight for us, because what if he turns on us? This would be the perfect time to get back in Saul's good graces. And so by the providence of God, David is sent away. So he's not at this battle. But Saul is. And so we have Saul and the Philistines coming head to head. Do you remember the name of the mountain that they're at?
Mount Gilboa.
Mount Gilboa. Yeah. They come to this mighty clash, and what happens?
Saul asks his armor bearer to kill him, so the Philistines
Yeah.
don't take him or kill him. Armor bearer does not, so Saul kills himself, and then armor bearer kills himself. I don't remember about his sons.
Yeah, so his sons died before that, right? His sons, like you can almost, it's kind of heartbreaking because you can probably imagine Saul looking on this hill and he sees one son falling after another, including Jonathan, who Jonathan this entire time has been a great guy, but he also dies in this battle, right? And then eventually it gets to Saul and he says, I don't want these people to kill me because the worst things could happen. They could make him a prisoner. They could do all these things to embarrass him. And he's still so caught up in himself. He says, no, I will take my own life. And he asks somebody else to kill him, but the armor bearer will not do it. So he falls on his own sword. And when the armor bearer sees that his king has done that, he does it himself. And so they both die. And then the Philistines come along and they chop off their heads and the heads of Saul's sons. And they go hang them up on a high place for everybody to see, to show that they have killed the king of Israel. And then the men of Jabesh Gilead come and they retrieve the heads and they give them a proper burial. And that's how the book of 1 Samuel ends.
Oh, and that they killed his sons because to them, it usually goes in a kingship, king to sons.
Exactly.
And so they're like, oh, they're done.
Yep.
Completely, but they don't know that God works differently.
Yeah. So from all earthly perspectives, this is why the break between 1st and 2nd Samuel, originally this was all one book. It was all just called Samuel, right? But it's a pretty fitting break right here because there's a lot of dramatic tension, right? It looks like Israel has failed. And from a perspective of like the law, I mean, this is wild, right? I mean, God made a promise to Abraham that he would bring deliverance through Abraham's seed. And now the kingdom of Israel has fallen to the hands of the Philistines, and the new anointed king of Israel has been living with the Philistines. It's not that great of a look. But what we're going to see over the course of the next few chapters is that God is going to work things around to where David is going to be on the throne. And he's going to end up on the throne without having to have politically maneuvered his way there. Right? People are actually going to come to him and ask him to be on the throne. But this chapter in particular is focused on his response to learning about Saul and Jonathan's fate. And it's going to be a very unexpected response. Not necessarily to us, because at this point we've kind of learned what to expect from David, but to anybody at that time period, it had to be a very surprising response. Because first off, let me just ask you, if you had been hunted down by a man for 10 to 12 years of your life, how do you think you would respond to the news of his death?
You'd probably be excited and rejoicing like William just said.
Yeah, you'd be like, thank God, this is amazing. But that's not how David's going to respond. So let's go into 2 Samuel chapter 1, and let's see how he responds. We're going to start off with a little bit of narrative, and then the chapter's going to end with a poem that he sings. Right? All right, I'm going to read this whole, these first 10 verses. Unfortunately, Sean is not with us today, so we don't get to have his amazing Bible reading voice, but I'll try my best. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. All right. So there's the first part of the story. We don't get to see David's response yet. We just get to see the first part. What are y'all's initial thoughts?
Crazy story, narrative right there.
It is a crazy story narrative, for sure. Yes.
The guy that... Is this the guy that killed the king? Or not killed the king, but took his stuff and ran?
Yeah, that's what this guy is saying he did. Yeah, there's something interesting going on here. Yes?
Is this guy good or bad? Because it sounds like you don't really know.
That is, I think, where you're supposed to be wondering about this. This guy wants to be looked at as good, I think. The issue is that this guy does not seem to know David very well. There is something interesting going on here. Because, and we'll break this in depth more as we walk through it. But in the last chapter, at the end of 1 Samuel, we see the account of Saul's death, right? And it says that his armor bearer would not kill him, so he fell on his own sword. And then it says the armor bearer fell on his sword, and they both died. We read nothing of another man showing up and doing this. But right here, this man says that he is responsible for killing Saul. So now the question becomes, is he actually responsible? Yes?
David was striking down the Amalekites, and then the guy that took his stuff is also an Amalekite.
Uh-huh.
So it seems fishy.
Yeah, well, it seems like there's definitely some irony going on there. So do you remember why David was striking down the Amalekites? This was also at the end of 1 Samuel.
Because it was the land of Judah. Well, they were trying to get rid of the people that were in the land.
So what had happened is that, remember, the Philistines had given David a city of Ziklag, and whenever he had gone off to war, the Amalekites had raided the city and had taken everybody captive. And remember, they were on the run, and David and his men chased them down and killed them all. Right? And they took all the spoil and plunder, and David had it given to all these people. And it was basically, that whole story was a sign that David was back to being actual David. Because for a while, he'd been doing some stuff that was really sketchy and didn't seem very man after God's own heart-ish. But finally, at that story, we see David being like a king should be. And so he was just overdoing that. And so we get to see that all these events are happening like pretty rapid fire. And so, yeah, we have him killing Amalekites, and then this guy also happens to be an Amalekite. There's something going on there, too. But what we see are there's two competing narratives. And some people will suggest that these two narratives totally contradict one another, and it shows that the Bible's not true. But I think those people aren't giving credibility, like, they're not giving enough credit to the Bible. Especially the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, which are filled with nuance. Right? That's what we have to recognize. These books are filled with nuance and political intrigue and all this different stuff going on. And especially since these books were originally one book, right? It was just Samuel. The stories take place back to back. So whoever compiled this stuff together, I mean, they obviously recognize that the stories that you see at the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of this chapter are different. The question becomes, why did he allow them both to be there? And I think that this guy's story lets us know that he's trying to get on David's good side. The issue is that he does not know David. And so let's walk through it, and I'll explain to you what I mean. So after the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, this is the story we were just talking about, he remained 2 days in Ziklag. Ziklag, once again, it's the city that the Philistines had given him, and it's kind of been his headquarters for the last, year and 3 months or something like that. I don't remember the exact time frame, but he'd been there for over a year, and this has kind of been his headquarters. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. All right, so right off the bat, what do y'all think about this guy?
He seems like he's lamenting.
What would make you think he's lamenting?
Because Saul and his sons are dead.
Yeah, but also just the the clothes being torn and the dirt on his head, right?
That's what they did in that day to show that they were lamenting.
Yeah, and I think we don't really do that nowadays, but if you saw somebody walking around like this, the message would probably be clear, right? He walks around like ripped clothing, dirt on his head. You'd be like, oh, this dude is not in a good frame of mind. So he comes up and he's looking like he's really sorry and sad. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. So this guy goes straight from the battle. He goes down to David. He falls to the ground. And what does it mean to pay homage?
Bow?
Respect.
Yeah, give respect, give honor to, give glory, right? He just bows down, and basically he's signifying that David is kind of like in authority over him, right? So this guy, he comes down, he's mourning, he's in a state of distress. He bows down before David, and David says to him, "Where do you come from?" And you can probably imagine that even at this point, David probably has an inkling of an idea where this guy came from. I mean, from one hand, I guess he looks like an Amalekite, so he might think the guy came from the other way, but David knows the battle that he just left, right? He knows that the Philistines were going to take on Saul, and he's probably been wondering how that battle turned out. And so he says to this guy, "Where do you come from?" And correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, could you go check in 1 Samuel, whenever he encounters the Amalekite slave, the interaction might be very similar to this. Remember, like, whenever they're going to chase down the Amalekites who'd captured them from Ziklag, like captured the people, and they're chasing them down, they find a slave, and the slave wasn't an Amalekite, I don't believe. I probably should have reviewed this ahead of time. But they come across a man who says that he had been a slave of the Amalekites, at the very least. And I was just kind of wondering if that was the same thing.
Then David said to him, "Who do you belong to? Where are you from?" And he says, "I'm an Egyptian, a slave of the Amalekite man."
Okay. Yeah, so it's just a kind of a very similar interaction. And so I wouldn't be surprised if this is also, it's supposed to be a callback to that. Because Samuel's filled with things like that. I mean, remember you have like the two accounts of David sparing Saul, and they're very similar, and you're supposed to kind of compare and contrast the differences. Mm-hmm. So in the former one, he came across an Egyptian slave of an Amalekite. He's just destroyed the Amalekites, and now he comes across another Amalekite. And so just based off of David's experiences with the Amalekites thus far, what do you think is going to end up happening to this dude? Probably going to end up dead, right? Not just because he's an Amalekite, but just based off what we've seen so far with David, the Amalekites usually end up dead. But let's move on. "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I've escaped from the camp of Israel." Okay, so you had an Egyptian who was seemingly a slave of an Amalekite, and now you have an Amalekite who was seemingly a slave of Israel. The Egyptian had been abandoned by the Amalekites. The Amalekite has escaped from Israel. I don't know if there's anything necessarily important about those details, but there is a kind of contrast going on between those two stories. "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And so David picks up on the fact that they're talking about the war that had just gone on, or the battle between the Philistines and Saul. And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." He's probably eager because he knows that his best friend and his former mentor turned enemy were fighting in this battle. "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Does this bring to mind any other passages from Samuel to y'all?
Would it be the story of Eli?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever they come and tell him that his sons are dead, but he was more, was it that he was more worried about the Ark of the Covenant being taken?
Yes. Yeah. Once again, these are just like, Samuel's filled with stuff like this, just callbacks. So you'll remember, this is back at the beginning of Samuel. There was this priest named Eli who had these wicked sons, and they took the Ark of the Covenant out to battle. And Eli's sons were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was taken. And you have this moment where it says that this man came up to Eli, and he says, "I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today." Right? Same type of language. And Eli responds, "How did things go, my son?" Right? So same response. How did things go? Then the one who brought the news replied, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. And your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken." And especially whenever you look at this in Hebrew, there's an emphasis here, right? This happened, and moreover, this happened, and moreover, this happened. Like, so each one increases, right? So you have him saying, hey, everybody fled before the Philistines. And not only that, a lot of people were killed. And not only that, but your sons were killed. And not only that, but the Ark of God was taken. And then it says, when he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. Right? So Eli dies, and we kind of talked about that back in 1 Samuel, where it's kind of a critique on Eli a little bit. Because as a priest, he should be concerned about the Ark of God, but he's also a terrible father. Because whenever they mention it, it doesn't say, and when he heard about his kids dying, he fell backwards. No, like, he took that news fairly well. But whenever it mentions the Ark of God, he falls backwards. Right? And we talked about Eli's a kind of ambiguous character where he was very spiritually minded, but he wasn't much earthly good. Like, he just wasn't a very good father and stuff. There's really not any good fathers within the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's kind of just a weird thing to notice. But we see a very similar interaction there, right? Somebody escapes the battle lines. They report what's happening. There's increasing stakes. And then you have to see the person's response. So right here, David says to the young man, how did it go? And he answers, the people fled from the battle. Right? That's how the other one started, right? The people fled from the battle. And also, many of the people have fallen and are dead. Whoa. Very similar, right? It's people fled. People are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. No mention of the Ark of the Covenant or anything here, right? But we have that same thing. People fled, people are dead, and Saul and Jonathan are dead. And so the thing that he finishes off on tells us what David probably cares about most, right? Because it's like, okay, people fled, that's fine, people lose battles. Okay, yeah, people die in battles. But Saul and Jonathan being dead, I mean, David cares most about that, but probably not for the reasons this guy thinks. If you're this guy bowing before David reporting this, why do you think you would save that information for last, and why do you think David would care about that most deeply? Got to head out?
Yeah.
All right. No problem, my friend. Have a good night. Keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy.
Okay. Good night, y'all. See you later, Benedict.
Bye, Ben.
So, if you are this guy kneeling before David, why do you think he would care deeply about Saul and Jonathan being dead?
Well, they're part of his family.
He cares about him.
Is that what this guy doesn't know David, though. He doesn't know he cares about him. That's the issue. I'm trying to get you to not think from the perspective of somebody who's read the book.
Okay, so my guess is that because if Saul is dead, that maybe David could then be king.
Yes, from a political perspective, dude, the king is dead, his heir is dead. The throne is yours. Right? That seems to me what this guy is trying to say, and I think you'll see that reinforced by what follows afterwards. And if you have that in mind, his story makes a little bit more sense. Right? I think that he's trying to make a political move here. He bows down, he pays homage, he says, Israel, they fled away. The people are dead. They have no king. There's no heir to the throne. I'm bowing down before you. Right? So to me, there's some political implications here. Like, dude, it's your time to shine. Were you going to say something?
He wants to be a second-hand man.
Maybe, right? I mean, I don't want to read too much into it, but it's possible. I think this guy has political motivations for sure. And at the very least, this guy might have heard news of what happened to the Amalekites, and he's like, maybe I'm just going to suck up to this guy. David responds and says, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? So David hasn't yet unveiled his true emotions. He's still staying very stoic, right? We don't know fully how he's going to respond. Instead, he's being very pragmatic here. How do you know? Right? And you've got to wonder, what's he thinking here? Is he just that's what I love about Samuel, is that there are places where he'll just outright tell you what somebody's feeling, but there's other places where it's kind of asking you to wonder here. Right? And obviously it's not, you don't want to go too far with the speculation. But what is David thinking here? Does he believe it? Is he curious? Is he how is he responding? How do you know? Does he doubt that the guy is telling the truth? Does he think that the guy was involved? Or is he just asking for confirmation? Like, how did you figure this out? Like, where did you get your news? Were you an eyewitness? There's a lot of different things that could be going on here. How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the young man who told him said, by chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. All right, so let's summarize this guy's story so far. What does he say happened?
He's on Mount Gilboa, and he's seeing Saul and his sons, if I'm correct, leaning on their spears, and Saul asks him to basically kill him.
Yeah. So what does leaning on your spears mean in this context?
A spear in his head on it.
Well, so not with his head on it, but pierced by it, right? He is pierced by this. So whenever it says that Saul fell on his sword, this guy's saying he leaned on his spear. You could suggest, well, that story doesn't seem to add up if you're differentiating between sword and spear. I'm not going to go that far because maybe they're just using them as the same terminology. But at the very least, the different terminology would suggest to me something fishy's going on here, right? So he's like, I came across Saul, and he was leaning on his spear, so he was impaled. But what does he say happened?
He called out to the Amalekite.
Yeah, he wasn't dead yet, right? He calls out, he's like, dude, finish me off. But apparently, during all of this, he has a conversation with the man. He's like, hey, come over here. Where are you from? All right, yeah, you'll do. To me, the whole scenario is kind of weird, right? And that's why I want to highlight it, because people debate, like I said, do these stories contradict? At the end of 1 Samuel, it just says that Saul killed himself. It doesn't mention anything about somebody coming off and finishing him off. This guy says, well, I just happened to be there, and I came across him, and he asked me to kill him, and so I did it. Okay, now let's go back once again to the possible political motivations this guy might have. If he were fabricating a story, why might it be advantageous to him, from his perspective, to include that detail?
That just happened to be on Mount Gilboa?
Well, just the whole story.
Okay.
If he was hypothetically fabricating the story.
Because he would be responsible for killing the king of Israel. And
Yes.
so, he had already come to David and was like, hey, the throne is yours. But at that point, David didn't know that the person he's talking to would be the one who actually killed him. And
Yeah.
so now he's elaborating. He's like, not only is, the throne open, but I'm the one who got it for you.
Exactly.
I killed him.
Yeah. So you can see, I'm not going to go so far as to say this guy was fabricating, but that is kind of where I lean. I lean towards the idea that what actually happened is what we saw at the end of 1 Samuel. Saul died, and that's how it happened. And I think that what probably happened is that this guy just came across Saul when he was already dead, but before the Philistines found him. That's what I think. I don't know. People debate about this. But from a political perspective, this guy is bowing before David, and he says, your enemies are dead, and I'm the one who killed them. You now have the throne. And notice what he's going to say here. I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head, and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. You see how this guy might be politically scheming, right? He's saying, yeah, I came across Saul, and he was already on the verge of death, but he wasn't quite dead yet. And so he asked me to finish him off, and I did it. I killed him for you, my Lord. I killed him. He's dead now. And not only that, but I brought his crown and his armlet to give to you. So to me, this dude definitely has ulterior motives. And so I don't know whether his story is true or not. It could be true. But he's at least presenting it as it is true. And really, whether it's true or not does not matter. Because through him saying it like this, he's revealing the contents of his heart. Because no matter what, we know David's perspective. We know something this guy does not. We know that David does not like the idea of anybody touching Saul. Right? Because Saul is the Lord's anointed. We know that. This man doesn't know that. This man thinks, I've heard about you, David. You've been on the run from this guy for a long time, and I got him out of your hands. There you go. And here's his crown. So this dude is so proud. And so whether the story's true or not does not matter. What does matter is that he does not know David's heart. And so he is here trying to make a clear political ploy, and he's trying to say, hey man, the throne is yours. Happy birthday. But he just doesn't know David's heart.
No, he just thinks that he hit the jackpot probably.
Yes. Yeah, no, he probably thinks like, man, this is going to go good for me. Like, especially if he was a slave for Israel, right? He might have been a slave under Saul, and he thinks, man, I'm going to become like a lieutenant. Like, I'm going to go down in history as the Kingslayer. No, he's going to go down in history as the one slain by the future king, right? So I just kind of love that because the author of Samuel doesn't ever tell us whether or not this guy's story is true. He just gives us enough information to let us know where this guy's heart is behind it. And that's what matters, because remember, Samuel is all about the heart, right? Man looks to the outward appearance, the Lord looks to the heart. David doesn't care whether the story is true or not, right? David is just hearing what this guy is saying, but what the guy is saying reveals his heart, and David's going to respond that way because David is responding to this man as the Lord would respond to the man, right? That's what's really cool. And so this guy shows up, he's down for David, he's like, hey man, I mean, I killed him. He asked me to do it and I killed him. Which also, think about the humiliation of that. He's actively insulting Saul, right? He's saying the king of Israel couldn't even manage to kill himself. And he had to ask me, an Amalekite, to do it. That's not an honorable death, right? So he's even taking away the honor in Saul's death, which we know that Saul's death, no matter what, wasn't honorable. He killed himself, right? But this guy's taking even that away from him. He's saying, oh yeah, he had to ask me to do it. Just a little Amalekite, wow. I mean, think about that. Mighty King Saul, tall, dark, and handsome, having to ask me to kill him. Well, I did it, David, and now the crown is here for you. He is probably so proud of himself. He's like, man, I am eating good tonight. But let's see how David responds. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. David said to him, how is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Love it. Like, this is why I love the story of David. Because this guy, I mean, like, think about how weird this would be in a movie, right? Like, think about Avengers Endgame, right? Whenever Iron Man snaps his fingers and Thanos disappears, and all the armies disappear. And everybody's so happy, right? The crowd cheers and applause. Now imagine that instead of Iron Man dying there, he shed a tear. Because he had just had to destroy the enemy. That would say a lot about his character, right? But instead, the whole goal of the movie was to destroy Thanos. But that was never David's goal. David was caught in this weird place where he loved Saul dearly. And he didn't want Saul to die. Yet he knew that in order for God's promises to be fulfilled, Saul would have to die. Even though Saul had done all this stuff against him, David still loved Saul. And that's what's so remarkable about David. That's what makes him a man after God's own heart, because he is so willing to forgive even somebody who never asked for forgiveness. I mean, to be fair, Saul did ask for forgiveness a few times, but he never really meant it. Like, David's just a remarkable figure. To where he has been on the run for 12 years. He has been forced into enemy territory. He has gone through all this stuff. And at the news that his enemy has been killed, he is so mad at the person who claims to have done it that he has them killed too. That is wild. What do y'all think of this? We're going to go through it verse by verse, but I want to hear y'all's thoughts.
Definitely a man after God's own heart, because we deserve nothing from God, yet God sent Jesus to take our help. basically.
Yeah.
Our sin on the cross.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that David does where David is more along the lines of what the Israelites, or what the Jewish people expected when they talked about the Messiah, right? Because they expected him to be like David, like a conquering king who comes here and does that stuff. But David's heart actions, like the actions that flow from his heart, are very similar to stuff we see from Jesus, right? It's just showing up in a different way. So I love that. Verse 11. This is the moment where David reveals his true colors. Is he going to grab the crown and put it on his head? That's what you would see in like a Game of Thrones or something, right? I mean, this is the moment you've been waiting for. But even imagine this, right? If this were a TV show, the last episode ends at verse 10, right? You have this guy bowing before David. I have brought the crown before you. It cuts to black.
Then you have to wait a year.
You have to wait a year, right? It's the end of the season. You have to wait until the next season airs. How is he going to respond? And then it picks up right where the last season left off. And you have David looking down at the crown. Then he looks up to the heavens. And you see tears falling down his eyes. And he tears his clothes. You were expecting him to jump and hoop and holler and be so excited. At last, I don't have to live in the desert. At last, I'm going to be king. At last, God's promises are coming true. But instead, he takes his clothes, he tears them. And notice this. So did all the men who were with him. What's interesting about that?
Well, it shows that, like, David himself is not, like, it's not only him that's good, but he trains his men that are with him to value the same things that he values. And you see that, like, the men have grown a lot because there was that one, I don't remember what chapter it was, but whenever Saul was, like, camping near them, and David and one of his men had went down into the camp, and the men that was with him, he was like, hey, like, God has given the enemy to you. Now's your time. Like, I'll take the spear and go straight through Saul's head. And he says, no, like, we're not going to do that. And so you see, like, time and time again, that his men keep thinking that it's time for you to kill Saul. You need to kill Saul now. But he always tells them no. Like, God hasn't handed him over. We don't touch God's anointed. And so you see them follow after David. And so you see he's a good leader, but the men have grown too.
Yep.
So.
Bingo. Yeah. In other words, David is great at discipleship. Right? I mean, this guy, think how weird that is. It's one thing for David to be mourning Saul, because David at least had a personal relationship with Saul. And yes, David went through all this stuff, but, at least he had the promise to look forward to that he would one day be king. And also, he's a man after God's own heart, so he's just set apart, right? He's different. We would expect David to respond differently. But it's not just David who responds that way. All of his men do. His men don't have that personal relationship with Saul. His men had been abused by Saul. That's why they went to David. Remember, these were the outcasts. These were the ones who were suffering under Saul's reign. They went and found David, and they've been on the run with him for all these years. They've been living in caves, in deserts. They've been away from their families. They've been going through all this stuff with David. And like Brianne pointed out, there were multiple occasions when Saul was right there and they said, David, this is your opportunity to kill him. But David taught them something. And he says, I will never place a hand on the Lord's anointed. And these guys learned the lesson, right? So just that little phrase right there, if you've been reading through the book, that little phrase means a lot. Because we see that David is capable of guiding people to God. Because these people were one way, and now they're another. And the only thing that happened in between was David. Right? David taught them, you don't touch the Lord's anointed, no matter what. I don't care how much he's caused you to suffer. I don't care how much oppression he's put upon you. He is anointed by God. And what is the word anointed? Do you remember in Hebrew?
Messiah?
Mashiach. Yeah, Messiah. Right? You don't touch the Lord's Messiah. And he's taught these people that. And that's really cool. So we see that David, even whenever he is suffering and on the run, is capable of teaching people how to respond properly to God's Messiah. And these people respond properly. Their oppression has come to an end, and they are no longer going to live in caves, but they are going to be moved into a palace in the next chapter. But they still mourn with David, because they recognize that yes, in one way this is victory, but in another way this is defeat. Because it's sad that Saul had to be brought to this place. right? It's sad that God, like there's a lot of things to mourn here, right? The people asked for a king, and in their asking for a king, Saul's fate was sealed. Because they asked for a worldly king, and the luck of the draw was that Saul happened to be the worldliest guy there. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and the definition of worldly. He didn't want to be king, but he was chosen because he was the definition of worldly. And so Saul's fate is kind of just reflective of the people of Israel. His death on Mount Gilboa and his humiliation is a result of the people's question for a king, right? They asked for this. And so they mourn because the idea of the Lord's anointed one being murdered in such a gruesome way, it's horrible. And so I love that David's taught them that, right? David has taught them this is a sad thing, and yes, it's helpful for us, but that doesn't mean that it's something to celebrate. And so they all mourned together. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And keep in mind that most of the people, hey mama, keep in mind that most of the people here are probably from the tribe of Judah, right? And so there does seem to be that kind of distinction right now between Judah and the rest of Israel, which is going to come back into play during the time, like after the time of Solomon and everything. But they all mourn for them because that's still their brethren, right? They are still family. And so yes, it's good for them, but it's still something really sad. And I just love the nuance there, right? Because a lot of the times we are tempted to just celebrate things that benefit us. But really, we should celebrate things that benefit God. And this is a horrible situation, right? God allowed Saul to be king to teach the people a lesson. But as a result, Israel had to suffer this severe humiliation and Saul had to die, right? And so it's like, yeah, we're benefiting, but at what cost? And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." So this is where David's going to just get furious, right? So he asks the guy where he's from. The guy says he's an Amalekite. And it makes you wonder how David would have responded if this guy was a fellow Israelite. It makes you wonder if he would have been more gracious or more severe. I don't really know either way. But Amalekites, what we know about from Scripture at least, is that the Amalekites were kind of cursed by God. Do you remember the story with the Amalekites?
Weren't they one of the groups of people that God said to totally destroy?
Yeah, he said to totally destroy them because they're the ones who attacked the people of Israel whenever they were wandering in the wilderness, right? Whenever they came out of Egypt, the Amalekites raised arms against them. And God's like, you do not mess with my people. And so he said, totally destroy the Amalekites. But they keep coming back and kind of being a thorn in the flesh, right? And so you have this guy, he says he's an Amalekite, yet he killed the Lord's anointed. It's like, did y'all not learn y'all's lesson? David said to him, "How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Like, it makes you wonder if he's just calling the guy stupid or if he's actually in awe of the fact that the guy could be so stupid, right? Either way, he's saying the guy's stupid. But I want to know how he said the question, right? How could you not be afraid? Because David's like, I trembled at the thought of it. He says, a few years back, I cut off a piece of his cloak and I felt guilty. And you're out here boasting about killing him? Do you have no fear of God? So he's like, dude, who do you think you are? Have you not heard about who the God of Israel is? And I love that. Like, he never says, like, do you have no fear of touching the king of Israel? That's not what he says. He doesn't say, do you not have any fear of touching Saul? For him, the reason why you don't touch Saul is not because he's the king of Israel. It's because he's the Lord's anointed. Because David is always focused on God. And he says, God called Saul special. And you dared touch somebody that God called special? Oh, and you think I'm going to be happy with you? He says, do you know what type of kingdom I'm going to set up? It is not a kingdom that takes God's choices lightly. And so he's like, if you think I'm going to honor you for this, you are sorely mistaken, because that is not the type of king I'm going to be. You may have laid a crown before me, but you took a crown off somebody who should have been buried with it. And it's like, he's not happy with this guy at all. How is it You were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed. Interestingly, whenever you're reading through the Psalms, notice how often it talks about really a theology of the Lord's anointed one. Right? Just the idea of there being this protection around the Lord's anointed and how God will come to his aid and save him. A lot of that is derived from David. Right? These are David's songs, and he's singing about God and his Mashiach and the protection he puts over that. So he always sings about this. Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go execute him." This is David's first action. It's his verse, technically, it's kind of a royal decree in many ways, right? He is commanding somebody to execute capital punishment, right? He's saying, go execute this man. What do y'all think about that? David's first act as, he hasn't been crowned king or anything, but in many ways, he recognizes that without Saul and Jonathan in his way, he is now kind of the king. And in many ways, he's also kind of been the king ever since he was anointed. What do y'all think about him making this choice right here as his first act? What does it say immediately about David's kingdom?
What he values.
What does it say about him valuing? What does he value?
He cares more about, God and, he wants to align his kingdom with God's values, and he cares more about what God thinks than what man thinks.
Yeah. He cares more, and even more than that, he cares more about what God values than how he benefits. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's going to be the issue. Later on, when we get to stories like with David and Bathsheba, that's why he's going to be so torn up. Because he loses sight of that. Right? With the David and Bathsheba story, he sees something that will benefit him, even though it's contrary to the values of God. And then whenever he's called out on it, he's going to say, I have sinned against the Lord. Right? Because to David, that's what it means to be a man after God's own heart. It is valuing God's values and valuing God's will above everything, even your own self-preservation. And that's why David thrives whenever he's on the run. Whenever he's out in the wilderness, he's doing great. Because he's literally setting aside all of his own personal desires in order to be faithful to God. And he says, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. I'm just going to suffer in the wilderness, and I'm going to thirst for God. And he's doing great out there. That's why he's out in the wilderness, and he's singing Psalm 63, Oh God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul longs for you. My soul thirsts for you, as in a dry and weary land. That's what David cries out. And he's in the desert. He's fine when he's on the run. But now what we're going to see is he's going to be put into the palace, and things are going to go downhill in a little bit. Fortunately, not right off the bat. But right off the bat, we do see is that David's kingdom will be different. We never saw anything like this happening with Saul. Right? Saul had people executed because they threatened his own self-interest. So there's a big difference. Remember, Saul had priests of God killed because they wouldn't tell him where David was. And because they had conspired with David. David wouldn't do that. But David will have somebody killed for boasting about killing Saul. Go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I've killed the Lord's anointed. So David makes it clear, I think the main reason the author includes that there is just to make it clear why David's doing this. It's not just because he's a bloodthirsty king who likes having people killed. It's because this guy had the audacity to boast about doing something that is directly contrary to God. And ultimately, we do know that somebody had to kill Saul. Right? Somehow Saul had to die for David to be put on the throne. This was inevitable. But in David's eyes, that does not mean that the action itself was a good action. And that's something that I really like about the Bible, is that it doesn't give you easy black and white answers there. There's places where you get to, whenever the people are having to be sent out to exile, God sends the Assyrians and the Babylonians to discipline the people of Israel. And from some people's perspective, they might say, oh, well, that means that what the Assyrians and Babylonians did wasn't bad. And God says, no, of course it was bad. And they're going to be punished for it. But it's but God, you're the one who sent them. And he's like, well, yes, but they didn't know I was sending them. Right? God was using his sovereign power to guide them to oppose Israel, but they were doing it out of the pride of their hearts. And they were doing it out of their own selfish ambition. They were just unknowingly accomplishing God's will. And so what they were doing was still evil. And so I love that the Bible doesn't dance around that, and it confuses people because we love black and white, good and bad. But what we see here is that yes, Saul needed to die for David to be on the throne, but that doesn't justify the killer. Same thing with Judas, right? Yes, somebody had to betray Jesus for him to be on the cross. That does not make Judas's actions correct, because he wasn't doing those to accomplish God's will. He was doing it out of selfish ambition. This guy, if he actually did kill Saul, it wasn't because he was trying to serve God's will. It was because he was trying to serve himself and put David on the throne for selfish reasons. And so I want to clarify that, because it's always about the heart. It's not just about the action. And that's what 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel demonstrate very clearly. So David says to him, "Your blood be on your head, for by your own mouth you have testified, I have killed the Lord's anointed." He specifically says, your own mouth has testified against you. Right? Self-incrimination. Ha! Got you. You admitted to the crime. You have harmed the Lord's anointed. And the guy's probably like, well, that's not how I worded it. And he's like, yeah, but that's what you did. Right? You might have said one thing, but I heard right through your lies and your deceit. And you are a foolish man. So he has the guy killed. I think that's a really strong way, because it sends a very clear message. If you're going to be part of David's kingdom, you're going to have to learn to serve God and submit to his will. That's cool. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar. He said, and we're about to go through the psalm. Right? And the psalm is going to take us through the rest of this chapter. And so this is going to be how we're going to end up, we're going to wrap up this whole thing. The book of Jashar, I don't know what it is. It's apparently another book that existed at this time period. It was not deemed, obviously, biblical canon or anything like that. It was probably just a collection of different song books, like just different songs from that time period. I like little details like that. It lets you know that there's books that existed at that time period that like aren't in the Bible, which we know to be the case, but I just like it being acknowledged here. I also find it very interesting that David instructs for this psalm to be taught to future generations. That's kind of cool, right? So what does that tell us about David's intentions with this song that he's about to sing? The fact that he wants it to be taught.
He wants the people to remember for generations and generations.
Yeah. And what specifically does he want them to remember?
You don't harm the Lord's anointed.
You don't harm the Lord's anointed. But it also seems he wants them to remember the legacy of Saul and Jonathan, which is pretty remarkable because Saul's been hunting him down for the longest time. And also, to me, I think it suggests that David isn't just making a political stunt here, right? Because you could argue, oh, well, David just mourned Saul and Jonathan so that the people thought he was sad. But that's not what he's doing. Like, this isn't just like a one-time thing where he's like, oh, boo-hoo. No, he's like, record what I'm singing right now and teach it to the future generations that they can remember these great men. What a mentality. You know, I mean, think about how easily we get annoyed with people who've done barely anything to us. Imagine somebody actively trying to kill you for 12 years. And then at their death, you're like, I'm going to sing a song testifying to how great a person this was. It's just like remarkable. I mean, like you can see the foreshadowing of like the forgiveness of Jesus, right? I mean, like if a man is capable of this sort of forgiveness, how much more is God capable of forgiveness? I mean, David is literally looking at Saul. Like Saul never apologized. Saul never fully repented. I mean, he tried multiple times and he eventually kind of backed off, but they never reconciled fully. But David is singing of Saul like an amazing person. I just think that's remarkable, right? How much more will God forgive us whenever we actually do come in repentance and faith? I just think that's cool. So this is the song he sings. We're just going to go section by section. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. All right, what do we see right off the bat?
It's kind of talking about his story, kind of.
Mm-hmm. So he's reflecting on Saul and Jonathan, right? And I just want, let's remember something that sets apart, like, we're talking with poetry here, right? That's different than narrative. One helpful thing for us to remember is that Hebrew poetry is different than, like, American poetry or English poetry. English poetry usually will try to, like, rhyme words and stuff like that. They're not super concerned with that here. Typically, the way that Hebrew poetry worked is a thing called parallelism, right? And we see this with the book of Proverbs, right? We've talked about that quite a bit. To where the first line and the next line, they usually have some sort of relationship where they will either be restating the same thing or they'll be stating opposite things. They'll be contrasting. They'll be building upon one another. But usually they're like couplets that reinforce one another or restate something or help convey a message. And maybe like you have to read both of them to fully understand what's being said. And so let's take it maybe 2 lines at a time. Your glory, O Israel, is slain in your high places. How the mighty have fallen. What is he saying right there?
It's talking about Saul and John.
Yeah. And what does he call them?
Glory and mighty.
Yeah, glory and mighty, right? He calls them the glory of Israel. Which in one way is true just because they were the ones in charge, right? The glory of Israel, because glory just kind of represents reputation, right? The reputation of Israel, it's slain on the high places. They were slain quite literally on a hill, right? So the glory was literally slain on a hill, but the language he uses is meant to make it bigger. It's almost mythological, right? Your glory, O Israel. It's like esteeming them as like these amazing figures. They're like heroes in his eyes. And in high places, he could have just called it hill, but he says high places. High places were typically associated with worship, right? Usually it was pagan worship. I don't know if that we're supposed to read that into it here, but your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. He's exalting them like they're amazing figures. How the mighty have fallen. I mean, he is just like right off the bat, he's painting these guys like they're these amazing individuals. He doesn't say anything about, yeah, that Saul guy really sucked, though. Like, he doesn't say that. We wouldn't blame him if he did, but he doesn't. Right? I mean, we have other Psalms, like, where he's, like, praying, he's like, God, deliver me from my enemies. But now that he has been delivered, he's like, oh, the glory of Israel has been slain in the high places. The mighty have fallen. He's sad. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Okay, Gath and Ashkelon, what are those places? Philistine territory, right? Who were the ones who killed Saul? Philistines, right? And so he's saying, don't tell it to the Philistines. Why might not he want them to tell it to them?
It's like a victory poem.
Yeah, lest they get cocky. And that's exactly what he's going to say. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult, right? So you see the parallelism, right? Lest the daughters of the Philistines, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised, same thing, right? Remember whenever he's talking to Goliath the Philistine, who does this uncircumcised Philistine think he is? Right? Uncircumcised in the Old Testament just represents people who are not belonging to the covenant of God, right? Because remember, the Abrahamic covenant, what was the sign of it? Circumcision, right? And so there were people who did get circumcised who did not belong to the Abrahamic covenant, but by and large, circumcision was a very weird thing back then. And so very select people did it. And so uncircumcised refers to people who are opposed to God. Right? And so he says, don't let people mention this. Obviously, the Philistines are going to go mention this. I mean, I can guarantee you the Philistines are running everywhere being like, we've killed the king of Israel and we've killed his son. Like, they are rejoicing about it. But why would he mention this in the song? Right? Because he's not actually wishing for a genuine reality. Because, of course, it's going to happen. Why would he mention this in the song?
So that people in the future know where, like, David's just being open-hearted and he wants that to pass down exactly how he feels.
Absolutely. And that's another thing we need to highlight about poetry is that it is inherently more emotional than narrative, right? I mean, there is emotion in narrative, but poetry does not exist without emotion, right? Like, you literally, like, that's the issue that we face a lot of the times. People will read through the Psalms or they'll read through other poetry in the Bible and they'll read it like they would any other book. And you can't really do that. Same thing with like the prophets. It's all poetry. You have to recognize that, yes, I'm not saying don't read it literally. No, read it as the text is, but you have to read the emotion into it. You really can't understand it apart from that. So he's not saying, literally, go stop everybody from spreading this news. It's the emotion behind it. It grieves him that anybody would rejoice in Saul's death. And it grieves him that the enemies who killed Saul, even though technically Saul took his own life, but the Philistines are the ones who, were battling against him that led to the death. He's like, oh, I hate the idea of Philistines gloating over this. Let that not happen. I don't want them rejoicing. I don't want them exulting in this. They've killed the Lord's anointed. They've killed a glorious one. And so he is brokenhearted. He is being open-hearted, just like Olivia said. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. All right, so who is he talking to in this?
He's cursing the mountain of Gilboa.
Yeah, he's cursing the mountain itself. What was the mountain of Gilboa?
The battle where...
Yeah, this is where Saul died. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no field nor fields of offerings. So what is he cursing them with? What is he saying?
No rain.
No rain.
No moisture.
Yeah, he's saying, I hope you become a desolate wasteland. And I hope that nobody comes there to worship God. Because I don't want you to be associated with my God. And I don't want you to be associated with anything fruitful. Because you are the place where mighty men have died. Like, this is a really cool, epic poetry. Like, if you were to just read this in isolation, you would never expect that David and Saul were enemies. Right? You would just never think that. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled. It's not like defiled. It makes it sound like Saul was not a defiled person himself. Right? It's a very idealized portrait. And keep in mind, he is thinking about Jonathan here too. And obviously he loved Jonathan, as we'll see, very strongly. But there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. Like, it's just like, I love this stuff. Like, I just love like the heartbreak here. I don't love that David's going through it. I just love what it says about David's character that he would produce a song like this. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. What's he talking about here?
Talking about the enemy?
What's he saying about him?
I don't know, but I know they're talking about the enemy.
It's a bit tricky when we get to poetry, huh? From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty.
Cursing, like, he wants them dead.
Yeah.
Is it talking about their death was not in vain?
Yes, it is. Their death was not in vain. How did you get there?
Well, it says the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. So when I think of empty, I also think of vain.
Yeah.
So their death wasn't in vain.
Yeah. So he's saying they didn't die for nothing, though. Right? This is kind of that point where, everybody's grieving and they're at the funeral and they're acknowledging that the person died, but it's like, hey, but at least they went down with a fight. Right? They didn't die, they didn't turn into cowards, even though technically, we know that's not technically true. Right? Saul killed himself. Jonathan went down in battle, but Saul killed himself because in many ways he kind of was a coward. But David doesn't mention that. David isn't focusing on how Saul explicitly died. He's talking about the fight that Saul fought before that. Right? He says, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty. Right? He's looking at the blood and the carnage out there in the battlefield. The bow of Jonathan turned not back. Because remember, we know this, Jonathan was really good with a bow and arrow. Remember, we've seen scenes in 1 Samuel where he's shooting the bow and arrow? So apparently he was really good with a bow and arrow. And he says, the bow of Jonathan turned not back. Right? Even when, you can imagine the imagery, to talk about Avengers Endgame again. I love that scene where, they're everybody's down except for Captain America. And he stands there facing the army. He's got a broken shield. And the most reasonable thing he could do is run for dear life. But instead, he tightens the shield, and he gets ready to face against the army all alone. And then all of a sudden, the portals open up and everybody shows up, right? But that's the imagery David's going for here. The armies are surrounding them. But Saul and Jonathan are surrounded by dead enemies. And Jonathan and Saul, they're not going anywhere. Jonathan's still firing his arrows. Saul's still swinging his sword. And yeah, they're going to die. And the mighty are going to fall. But they're not going down without a fight. It's just a really cool, epic portrait of how he views these guys. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. What do we got going on there? I'm looking up a Hebrew word real quick.
I think he's praising their bravery. At least Jonathan's. Because I remember he was always there for David.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the first part. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. What's that about?
They were together and they died together.
Yeah, they lived together and they died together. I mean, he's taking this horrible thing and reframing it in a very positive light. I mean, there is nothing more horrific sounding than a father and a son dying in the same battle. Right? I mean, think about the women back home. Right? Saul's wife. Jonathan probably, he had a wife. Right? We know he had a kid. We're going to meet him later. But they had family. And receiving news that father and son died in the same battle. David's looking at that, and he's giving it a poetic spin. In life and in death, they were not divided. Right? Even death could not separate these two. That's how forged their bond was with one another. Which is interesting, because once again, we've seen Jonathan oppose Saul on behalf of David. But David is not wanting to view it in that light. Because David, I don't think he likes the idea of him and Saul being opposed. Right? Saul was constantly opposing him, but David was always seeking reconciliation there. And so I don't think David held anything against Saul. Which is just, once again, very remarkable. But he says, no. Nothing could separate them in life, and now nothing can separate them in death. Jonathan was by his father's side the whole way through, and Saul was by his son's side. And they loved each other so much that whenever one died, the other had to die too, because they could not go on living without the other. It's just a super amazing way to portray these people who, Jonathan's really great, Saul, but from David's perspective, that's what I love about David's poetry, is that it lets you see what's going on inside of his heart more than even just his actions typically do. They were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. This is just stuff to make them look like the most epic warriors in the world, right? I mean, they're just swifter than eagles, super fast, super focused, stronger than lions. They're larger than life. They're super strong. Typically, it's one or the other, right? Typically, you're really fast and not very strong, or you're super strong and not very fast. Not these guys. They had the whole package. And if they went down in battle, you know that it was an epic fight. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. It probably doesn't take a biblical scholar to recognize that this might be slight exaggeration. Especially because, to go back to Samuel, what did he say kings would do? Take. And most of the stuff that we've seen of Saul in 1 Samuel, at least, is him doing exactly that. And to be fair, we don't know about most of Saul's reign. We only have select moments until David is introduced into the picture, and most of what we know about Saul's reign is the final few years whenever he's opposing David and chasing him down. And during that time, he's allowing his whole kingdom to just fall apart. To where at this point, Israel is just a tiny little place, right? It's not that big. But that's not how David wants him to be remembered, right? I just think that's very interesting, right? Because David has the opportunity here to totally just slight Saul and talk about how terrible and nasty he was. But instead, he says to Israel, weep over your king. who did all these amazing things for you. And yeah, he knows better than all of them, all the bad things that Saul did. But he says, I don't want you to remember him for that. I want you to remember him for the amazing person he was. You can see how this guy is a man after God's own heart, right? I mean, this is what God does for us, right? He doesn't, like we've done so many things against him, yet he does not hold those against us. And instead, he chooses to look at us with the good things that he has imposed upon us. Because the thing is, I don't think Saul actually did that stuff, right? And if he clothed anybody luxuriously in scarlet, I can almost guarantee that he probably had ulterior motives for doing so. But David isn't focused on that. He is almost, in many ways, he's almost imputing a sort of righteousness onto Saul. And he's actually making him look more positive than he actually was. It'd be a totally different narrative if this was Saul's son proclaiming the song. But it's not. It's Saul's enemy. Which is it's just very interesting that you see this. We move on. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Right? That's kind of a repetition here. And here we get to the final verses, and I'm going to read through the whole thing, but there's one part we need to linger on for a second because we need to talk about it. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So 3 times throughout this song, David says the phrase, how the mighty have fallen. I guess that's the name of the song, right? Whenever it's repeated that many times, that's what you slap on the album. But I want to linger on the middle part, right? The rest of it's kind of repetition. You get what he's going for. But if you're sitting in this room, there's a phrase in here that you probably heard that raises some questions. And people love to make this weird, but I want to make it unweird for us. Y'all know what I'm talking about? All right. So Jonathan lies slain on your high places. Yes, he's talking about... So he talked about Saul and mourning over Saul, and now he's talking about Jonathan, right? So he's just transitioning to that. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. And I believe that he does mean this. He loved Jonathan. I mean, they made vows to one another. That Jonathan really was probably the best relationship David ever had. He was just a great guy. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. And now these 2 lines are the ones we've got to focus on for a few minutes, and we've got to explain, because people love going weird places with this. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. And those 2 lines right there single-handedly show us that David was actually a closet homosexual.
No.
No, and it drives me nuts. But people, and I'm not joking, people will say this. Right? And I have watched so many speeches, I have seen so many things where people will take these 2 verses and they will say this demonstrates that David and Jonathan had a gay relationship. I will say, even if that were the case, I would admit it. Because guess what? David's not a perfect individual, and so I have no problem if he did have a gay relationship. Guess what? He was a sinner. He also slept with a married woman, and so yeah, David does sinful stuff. So if this was about a gay relationship, I would have no problem admitting that. I'd be like, yeah, David had a weird phase. I would admit that. But that's not what's going on here. And it frustrates me whenever people impose that on the text because they're actually missing the point entirely. What is David saying here?
He loved him like a brother. Literally a brother.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it doesn't hurt that literally a few lines above he says, my brother Jonathan. Right?
Like a sibling. He's not
Jonathan got brozoned. What is David saying?
Very kind you've been to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm close with you. Like,
Yeah.
To me it was extraordinary.
Our relationship is like our hearts were like knit
Yeah.
in action.
Yes.
I think he's trying to express, because we talked about like poetry is very emotional, and he's trying to express like the depth of the relationship and like the depth of the love that they have for one another. And so he's like using something that people can relate to, which is a relationship between like a man and a woman and how much you love your significant other. He's saying in that same way, I loved Jonathan, not in a romantic way, but that like passion kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I do want to clarify, and I'm not, don't read this too much into the text because that's not the point of it. I just want to point out that David really doesn't have very good relationships with women in general. I mean, he's got a bunch of them, and typically all of them are just a big mess. So there could be a little commentary in there being like, yeah, dude, you were the one dude who like, I mean, we were bros, but like we actually had a good relationship going on there, whereas me and all these women, we just get into a lot of trouble. There's that. But that's not really what I think is going on here either. And I would actually suggest that whenever people try to make this about a homosexual relationship, they miss the point entirely and they actually take away from the point. Because if David is talking about a homosexual relationship, this isn't much of a compliment, right? Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. He's just talking about being gay. Right? Oh yeah, well, okay, turns out I like you more than I like girls. Really weird thing to say at the end of a battle hymn, right? And it takes away any compliment because all he's saying is sexual preference. And that's just it's not even a compliment. It's just like, because the implication really isn't even much about Jonathan. It's just like, yeah, it turns out I like guys. That's not what he's going for. Instead, the reason why this compliment works is precisely because it's not homosexual. Right? That's why the compliment is so severe. Because everybody knows that the relationship between a man and a woman is supposed to be the strongest relationship. Right? That is what we know because that is what has been ordained by God. Right? Marriage is supposed to point us towards God. And David is saying, like it goes back to what Brian was saying about the emotion. He's saying, let me think of the strongest possible relationship and go even above that. He's saying, that's what we had, Jonathan. So whenever you make it about homosexuality and stuff, you're missing the point entirely and you're actually diminishing the compliment. The whole point is that he's taking the height of all relationships and he's saying, we had even more than that. The love that you showed me was greater than the love I've ever experienced from a woman. Because we were genuinely the best of friends. And so whenever you make it weird, it just takes away what David's going for. It's highlighted by the fact that David is a heterosexual who loves women. And he's saying, but none of them can compare to the love I've had for you. And that brings the song to a nice fitting end. Because that becomes the emotional climax of the song. The whole time he has been praising them for all their valiant efforts that they've done out on the battlefield, but then it ends on a very personal note. Right? To where he's not, I mean, yeah, he goes back to the mighty have fallen and their weapons perishing, but the climax of the song itself is right there. Where it's saying, hey guys, mourn for all these people, mourn for them, mourn for them, mourn for them. But then he gets to Jonathan and he says, I'm mourning for you. And I'm distressed about you. Because I'm never going to be with my best friend again. And yeah, I'll be able to return to my wife and my other wives. And I'll go get my other wife back. But I'm never going to see you again. And I miss hanging out with you. And I'm going to miss hanging out with you. And that's what he's going for there. And so it drives me nuts whenever people try to read something weird into that. Because it totally takes away from the emotional impact of it. The impact comes from the fact that David is knowingly making a contrast. Right? He says, there's romantic love. And then there's the love that we had. And it surpassed even romantic love. And that's the beauty of it. Right? It was literally the bond of two people being knit together in a way that wasn't provoked by romance or this need. Like they didn't need all the benefits of romantic love to be bound together. Right? That's kind of the impact of it. Right? They didn't need all the, producing children or, the male-female dynamic or the physical pleasures of it. They didn't need that stuff. Right? They were bound together just because they were two like-minded individuals who both were seeking the same thing. And Jonathan saw David for who he was, and he recognized that David was going to be the king, yet he was not jealous. Instead, he gave him his armor, and he gave him his stuff. And David loved Jonathan and didn't feel any jealousy there either. They were both people who recognized that they were put in a very difficult situation, Yet there was no animosity between them. There was no bitterness. They just loved one another. That's the point. And so I hate people making it weird because it's like, no. It's not like, that's just people trying to push their like political agenda and trying to be like, oh, I gotcha. Stop. It's ridiculous. All you have to do is read the text and figure out what David's going for. And if you see how the song is formatted, you get what he's going for. And so he ends the song. It says, how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. And that is how David mourns Saul and Jonathan once he learns about their death. Going into next week, at long last, David will be anointed the king of Judah. But don't get your hopes up too early because he's not going to be the king of all Israel quite yet. That's still about 7 years away. For David. Lord willing, not for us. Lord willing, it'll only be a few more weeks for us. Just as a reminder, I will be with y'all next week as we go through 2 Samuel chapter 2. And then Ben and I will be gone for 2 weeks in Israel. But y'all are still going to gather together, and Brianne and Sean are going to be with y'all in chapters 3 and 4. I have already gone through it with them, so they know what's going on and everything, and we're all on the same page so that, we're not contradicting each other. And Lord willing, they're going to be recording this stuff so that even while we're in Israel, hopefully me and Ben can somehow find some time to watch it and see what y'all are up to so that we'll be all up to date whenever we get back. But it's going to be really cool. Y'all have any questions?
No.
Cool.
Great story.
Yeah. It's good stuff. I hope that y'all are excited to get back into 2 Samuel because, I don't know, I love the Samuel stuff. And I've really never done a super in-depth study through 2 Samuel. Like, I've studied it on my own, but I've never done it, like, with a group. So I'm really pumped to go through this because it's all just really exciting. One of y'all want to close this out in prayer? Preferably somebody who didn't pray at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you for allowing the chance for us to all meet here tonight and learn more about what you decided to have recorded for us to learn, to know more about you, to know how to apply what you've written to our lives, and get us to have a heart to just know what you want, not using this knowledge for any ulterior motives, and less love you have for us, and make us into disciples who can share this information with others and help transform lives and show them a greater joy than they ever thought, and know the certainty of all that you've promised. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.